Hey there. I want to talk about the planets in astrology, and we will briefly cover kind of which themes or area of life each planet is said to rule over, but that's actually not the point of this video. The point of this video is to talk about why. Why does each planet rule what it rules? Why does each planet rule each sign that it's said to rule? I think that's something that is often overlooked in astrology. These planets and their kind of affiliations, it's not just random. Why does Venus have to do with love and desire and art and whatnot? Whereas Mars is more masculine and active and bold. Why is that? It's not random. So I'm here to show you kind of the reason behind it all. I think this is really, not only do I find it really kind of interesting, and I think maybe you will too, but also it gives you such much more depth kind of to your astrological comprehension, I think, to understand not just what each planet rules over, but why it rules over those things. And I've broken this into four main parts. We're going to talk about the luminaries first, which are, of course, the sun and moon. And then we'll kind of start out with the inner solar system and work our way outward. So, first, there's the inner solar system: Mercury, Venus, Mars. Then there's kind of the middle ground, like the innermost part of the outer solar system: Jupiter and Saturn. And then lastly, we'll talk about the far, outermost part of the solar system: Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. And basically, the whole idea is that there are physical characteristics of each planet that corresponds to each planet's energy and what it kind of rules over. So, for instance, as I was preparing my notes, by the way, you might hear me kind of flipping back and forth through these pages of notes as we get into this video. But what I noticed, though, as I was compiling my little notes, was that there are five characteristics of each planet in particular that I think most correlate to its themes. There are some other, things that we may talk about as well. But definitely the temperature of each planet, the size, the proximity to the sun, the appearance of it, as perceived from Earth, and the speed. All of these things are patterns that correlate to, how we experience that planet's energy. So I'll talk about all that. I don't want this to be too formulaic, so I'm going to kind of wing it and kind of mix it up as we go along. But yeah, let's start out with the sun and moon. So the sun and moon, the main luminaries, they very clearly dominate the sky, right? The sun in particular. But it is very interesting that the sun and moon each take up the same exact space in the sky. Obviously, we know that the sun is much, much larger than the moon and much, much farther away. But because of their relative distance and size, as compared like from Earth, they occupy the same exact space in the sky, which is pretty unbelievable. That's either a really crazy coincidence or there's something more going on there, but I won't get into that too much. But basically, many cultures recognize that there are these kind of yin and yang components, not just to the sun and moon, but to the universe in general. This is just one really kind of clear example of how we live in a dualistic universe, right? Everything is kind of double sided. This is a key belief in Taoism, right? The yin and yang symbol. It's not so much good and bad. It's not like, good and evil like we would see in some forms of Christianity. That's not really what we're talking about here. It's not like the sun is good and the moon is evil. That's not what it is at all. What it is more so is that, the sun is more masculine. Almost all cultures throughout history regarded the sun as masculine and the moon as feminine. There are some exceptions, like I think particularly in very northern latitudes, like some of the Nordic peoples said that the moon was masculine and sun was feminine. My kind of idea on that, I think it's because, at those latitudes, the sun is not nearly as dominant of an energy, so it's easier to think of it as a more like feminine, more soft kind of energy. But generally speaking, we perceive the sun as masculine because, the masculine or the yang energy is much more dominant. It's much more conducive toward activity, spontaneity. The yin energies are much kind of heavier in nature, much more kind of considerate and careful. There is a wild side to feminine energy as well, which I think is important to recognize. We see that with Lilith, which we're not actually going to talk about a whole lot in this video, but I did just want to throw that out there that, we'll talk a lot about how, the moon and the feminine energy are so receptive and, inward focused. We'll talk a lot about that, but I did just want to briefly acknowledge that, the feminine energy isn't just completely like demure as everyone's saying. That is a huge part of it, but there is also another side. So I just wanted to acknowledge that real quick. Let's talk about the sun in particular, though. So why does the sun, like in astrology, the sun has to do with ego, self-expression, individuality. Um, why does the sun have to do with what it does? Another thing we'll talk about with each planet as well is, is each planet masculine or feminine, which we kind of covered, but also there are benefics and malefics in astrology. So benefics are planets that are very positive. They make life easier. If you have a benefic very strong in your natal chart or in a transit chart, that's a really good omen. It's going to be a good time. Success will come easier to you, right? And the opposite is true with malefics that are basically like evil planets. The ancient people regarded them as troublemakers, and they make life more difficult. Some planets are kind of just neutral. They're not really a benefic or a malefic. So the sun is a benefic. I would say it's maybe the third most auspicious planet in astrology. I will call the sun and moon planets, by the way, even though I know they're technically not, but it's just easier that way astrologically. But yeah, the sun is a very positive energy, and that's something that's I think really many of the metaphors and the meaning behind the sun are pretty easy to comprehend, honestly, and that in itself shows you part of the nature of the sun. Energies involving the sun are easy, they're direct. Literally, the sun and the moon never retrograde, right? So it's always a forward moving energy. The sun also moves forward consistently. So not only does it never retrograde, but it always travels at a consistent speed, as perceived from Earth. So yeah, it's very easily measurable, especially because the sun travels 360 degrees within a period of 365 days. So it's almost exactly 1 degree per day. Very steady, very consistent. The sun consistently brings that kind of life force, that vitality, the warmth, the energy, etc. So it makes sense why the sun would rule the fixed fire sign Leo, right? Because Leo is fixed fire, it's consistent. In many ways, someone who has planets in Leo, or particularly the sun in Leo, they almost kind of act like the sun does. They bring that warmth and vitality in a very consistent way. There's also a theme with the sun of selfishness, but also generosity at the same time. And that's something we also see with Leo. You could even talk about Aries as well, since sun is exalted in Aries. Aries has a lot in common with Leo. These are very selfish signs, but they're also very generous. Leo in particular does make everything about itself, but it's also very generous with its light and its energy. So the same thing can be said about the sun. The sun completely dominates the sky. You can't see the moon or any other planets or anything, when the sun is there, when it's present, it really kind of dominates these maybe less overpowering energies. So same was true for Leo. Leo can kind of dominate these other personalities that might be a little bit more nuanced or what have you. But yeah, so in a way, the sun does draw the attention to itself and kind of make everything about itself. But at the same time, it's giving so much. It's giving so much energy, so much life force. One theme that I noticed is that the same planets or sun or whatever, the same planets that are the hottest tend to be the most positive astrologically, if that makes sense. So of course, the sun, since it gives so much heat in itself is not always positive. Obviously, depending on your area, the sun can be overpowering sometimes. It can, dry everything up and heat everything up to a point that it does make life harder. But at the same time, I think the reason why these hotter entities, these hotter bodies, I think the reason why they are more positive astrologically is just because of how rare warmth is. I looked up the average temperature. The average estimated temperature of the universe is negative 455 Fahrenheit or negative 270 Celsius. So it makes sense that we need that warmth for life to exist. Therefore, we experience it more positively generally. So the sun, obviously the hottest and largest body in our solar system, it unsurprisingly tends to be a positive energy. It just brings that energy to life. It makes things more exciting, more direct. It's easier to be productive when you have a lot of sun energy. It's easier also to be confident as well. Cover a lot of different themes in this video, as you can tell already, but another one of them that is semi-related to all of this is that each of the traditionally visible planets, so all of them between Mercury and Saturn, each one rules two different signs, and each of those signs has to do with a theme that is opposite yet complementary to what that planet is about, if that makes sense. So for instance, Mercury rules Gemini and Virgo. We'll talk about how Mercury is about learning, and Gemini and Virgo represent two opposite yet complementary parts of what it takes to have the ultimate kind of learning, if that makes sense. The only slight exception to this is the sun and moon act almost as a unit here in what I'm talking about. I know this is kind of out there, but I think this is interesting and I think it's useful. And I've never heard this anywhere else either. I came up with this myself. But the sun and moon, these kind of represent like life force. They're very instinctual. This isn't like really complicated energy that we're talking about here. As we talked about with the sun, it's all very direct. It's very intuitive. It's very, it's very primal in a way. So what I would say is that, the sun and moon they kind of represent two opposite yet complementary parts of what it takes to have a solid identity, right? So in astrology, the sun and moon, like my sun and moon series is so popular. You can really, not just when it comes to observing the sky, but also when it comes to psychological astrology, you can do so much just with the sun and moon, right? They have to do with so much of how we experience everything. And so, yeah, part of that is, the sun and moon are the two most key components of what it takes to build a solid identity. So what the sun and Leo represent are confidence and pride, right? And then the opposite yet complementary theme that the moon and Cancer explore is humility. You could say maybe emotion as well. Those two things explore emotion. But I would say, I don't think it's always realized how humble Cancer is. We'll talk more about the moon in just a moment, but yeah, that's what I would say for the sun and moon. Both are exploring an opposite side of what it takes to have a truly solid identity. So the sun is more exploring the yang, the outgoing, the more active part of that, the confidence, the pride, the self-importance. If you have a lot of Leo placements, or if you have sun very powerful in your chart, you know that you are the best at something. Something about you is special, right? And that's not wrong. Like Leos really feel like they're the best at everything, and that's not wrong. We can all believe that and still have it be accurate. We all have something special. I think it's just that those that have Leo placements are more aware of that. You know what I mean? So that's, like I said, that's one part of what it takes to have a strong identity. Let's explore the other part though. And so that's where we can talk about the moon. So as I've mentioned, we've already talked kind of a lot about the moon. The moon forms that more feminine, more receptive, more subtle counterpart. The reason why the moon is considered feminine, like I said, it's because it's more of a kind of nurturing energy. The sun is nurturing as well, of course. Many cultures regarded the sun as kind of the sky father, moon as more of the mother. So both are nurturing in their own way. But with the sun, it's just much more brash, much more direct, maybe harsh at times, much like we would expect from a kind of traditional father. The moon is a little bit softer, right? The moon does nourish us. It literally, it's part of like cycles when it comes to agriculture and things like that. It's more, it's said to be better to plant during a full moon, right? Because the plants have that extra light and maybe warmth from the moon. So the moon does nourish us, but it is interesting though that the moon doesn't have any light of its own. It's just reflecting the light from the sun, right? So that's where you can see with transits or birth charts that have very strong moon energy, maybe with strong Cancer planets, or maybe Taurus as well, since moon rules Cancer and is exalted in Taurus. These energies are more receptive, so they're not just completely asserting their own agenda. They're much more open to what's going on around me. So that's where it becomes interesting. Like the moon, more so than any other body, we can really see each kind of phase of the moon, kind of like what you can see in this image, although technically these aren't moon phases. This is it's showing the like eclipse, I guess. But still, you get the idea. And I think, as I've said in a recent video, that really gives you such a clear picture of each aspect. You can see how when the moon appears half full, that means it's making a 90-degree aspect to the sun. So in a way, the moon will really help you understand a lot about aspects in general if you want to learn about that in astrology. But I kind of lost my train of thought. But basically, something about how we really see how changeable the moon is. Oh, and I was talking about how, so the way we experience the moon dramatically depends on what else is going on in the sky, right? I would say there are two kind of planets, you could say, that are the most dominated by the sun. I would say those are Moon and Mercury. So, the moon only shines when it's away from the sun, right? Whenever the moon is around the sun, I guess you could say it kind of submits to the sun. Maybe kind of like how we would imagine like a very traditional, wife and husband relationship, I guess, maybe. Not saying that that's necessarily needed or that's like the ultimate form of things, but again, we're exploring more of the like receptive side of femininity. That's not the only side there is, but that is one side. So that's kind of what we see with the moon. The moon can shine, but it's not going to shine around more dominant energies, right? So we see the same thing with Cancer. Cancer as a sign is much more shy, kind of a timid sign. But Cancer can shine very brightly if there aren't more dominant personalities around. Cancer has that a little bit of adaptability that kind of way, So you can see how that connects to the way we perceive the moon. Also, with the moon's phases, you can see the moon is constantly changing. So, the moon has a lot to do with cycles in general. It kind of helps us be aware of cycles in general. And that's another connection to females. Females are more aware of cycles than men are traditionally, right? Of course, there are always exceptions to that. But that's one part of this too. That's part of why women are more intuitive, generally speaking, more open to different ideas and things that are more non-physical in nature. Like astrology, for example, is definitely a women-dominated kind of theme. So you can see kind of connections to the moon, how the moon is constantly changing, it's constantly cycling. So that's part of why the moon has more to do with emotion, I guess. Constantly changing. Also, I think I already touched on this, but moon ruling Cancer, and moon being overshadowed by the sun. It was voted recently on my channel that Cancer and Virgo are the most humble signs, right? So I found it very interesting. Leo is probably the proudest sign, and the signs immediately next to Leo are the most humble, right? So I don't think that's a coincidence. Leo, since it is ruled by the sun, is most comfortable kind of being the center of attention. Cancer and Virgo, being ruled by Moon and Mercury, are more comfortable having less attention. They are overshadowed by the sun, but they're comfortable with that kind of situation. So like I said, Cancer can have times where it does shine, but at the same time, oftentimes Cancer does like to be kind of in the shadows or behind the scenes more so. They're more comfortable in kind of like very safe environments. You know what I mean? So it makes sense to, the moon shines much more brightly at night when things are more peaceful, generally speaking. So again, there's connections to Cancer as well. That pretty much sums that up, I think. So let's talk about Mercury, Venus, and Mars. So Mercury's an interesting one. I talked about how, in a weird way, there are connections between the moon and Mercury. Moon has everything to do with emotion. Mercury has everything to do with thoughts and communication. So in a weird way, they almost do kind of act like counterparts with certain things. I think they have the most to do with like very small picture stuff, and part of that is because the moon and Mercury travel faster than any other like kind of planet in astrology. Mercury's the fastest moving planet, and a huge theme with Mercury is how changeable and multifaceted it is. Literally, if you look at this image, you can see how Mercury is blue and orange, which are kind of opposing or complementary colors, right? So that's just one of many examples of how Mercury is at both ends of the spectrum. It can be blue, it can be orange, it can be hot, it can be cold, it can be fast, it can be slow. Pretty much every way you measure it, Mercury is at both sides of the spectrum. So it's very interesting how Mercury rules over Gemini and Virgo, two mutable signs, which, them, like one of the main kind of key aspects of Gemini and Virgo is that they are multifaceted. Both can be very shy or very talkative. They can be very adaptable. They're very adaptable. That's kind of the whole key point. But yeah, Mercury, let's kind of run through these little statistics here. So, well, for one, we talked about how, because Mercury is the closest planet to the sun, it's almost always overshadowed by the sun. I actually have an image of this for you to show if I can find this. So, and I'm going to be really honest, I don't think I've ever actually seen Mercury in the sky. And the reason why is because Mercury's always so close to the sun. You can only see Mercury, for one, Mercury has to be a certain distance away from the sun. And then even then, it will only be visible either immediately after the sun sets or immediately before the sun rises. So it's very rare to actually see Mercury. So that really just gives you an idea of how overpowered Mercury is by the sun, at least from our perception. So I find it very interesting then that the signs that are ruled by Mercury, which again are Gemini and Virgo, both of these signs are very nervous. Both can be very shy. I don't think everyone realizes how shy Gemini can be, but Gemini is a very shy, kind of nervous sign. So both of these signs don't always do well with attention. They actually enjoy being kind of overshadowed or, working kind of behind the scenes more so, generally speaking. Of course, they do have that range where they can be a little bit more visible sometimes. But generally speaking, like one example of this is that Gemini and Virgo are the most rare signs, sun signs for U.S. presidents to have. Very rare for a U.S. president to have Gemini or Virgo very strong in their chart. JFK is one exception to that. I think he's Gemini sun with Virgo moon. But that's a very rare exception, so that's just one example of when it comes to like politics and appearances and, being a celebrity. It's not usually going to happen with Mercury. Mercury's not a dominant energy in the sky. It's never going to be the brightest star in the sky. It's not even going to be in the top 3 or 4 or 5. You know what I mean? So there is meaning there. But yeah, this is an image showing you kind of just a general idea of what like Venus and Mercury would look like in the sky. Mercury and Venus, because they're closer to the sun than Earth is, they always appear near the sun. Mercury is always within 30 degrees of the sun. I believe it's actually technically within 28 degrees of the sun. And then Venus is always within 2 signs or 60 degrees from the sun. So that affects the way we perceive it. Venus is a little bit different. We'll talk about that soon. Venus is far enough away and it's bright enough that Venus can really not necessarily dominate the sky, but it can be, definitely one of the brightest things in the sky. Mercury, though, much different, So anyway, that is part of this. But yeah, let's talk about these differences. Another thing with Mercury, it's one of the smallest planets in the solar system. I almost said in the United States. It's very small and very dense. It's a very heavy, like kind of dense and small planet. So what I've noticed is that these planets that are smaller tend to be more like focused. So Mercury does have a lot to do with like mental focus. It's a very detail-oriented planet in astrology. But let's talk about these these variances, the multifaceted nature of Mercury. So part of why Mercury is so variable is because out of all the planets, Mercury retrogrades the most often. It doesn't spend the most time retrograde. That would go to Pluto. Pluto spends almost 50% of the time retrograde. So that's slightly different. So Mercury doesn't spend the most time retrograde, but Mercury retrogrades the most frequently, 3 to 4 times a year. So because of that, and because of how close it orbits to the sun, Mercury can travel very fast. Besides the moon, Mercury is the fastest moving kind of planet that we talk about in astrology. Um, so Mercury can travel very fast, but it also has many periods where it will slow down, appear to stop, and then travel in reverse, at least from our perception, as you know. One quick side note on that as well, because Mercury travels so quickly and then retrogrades so much, Mercury, out of all the planets, Mercury aspects more planets than any other planet does. That's why Mercury is said to be the messenger god. It's close to the sun. Another side note with that too is that in modern astrology, Mercury is regarded to have everything to do with information, but technically, traditionally, the sun was said to be the source of information, not just like vitality and life force, but also information and intelligence. Mercury is more just the conveyor of the intelligence. So, for instance, like I'm manic.mercurian. My chart is very heavy with Mercury. All of this information, like, I didn't come up with this. I didn't invent this. It's not my information. I've just observed this. I've taken this from different places, and then now I'm passing it on. That's just one example. Mercury. That's what Mercury more has to do with. It's because of its proximity to the sun and because it makes so many aspects to all the different planets. It's kind of like Mercury is conversating. It's connecting with all these other planets. More so than anything else. So yeah, that's why in so many cultures, Mercury has connections to like Hermes, for example. It's always kind of the messenger god. It can be easy to see why we associate it with information, but I do think it's an important distinction to note that Mercury is just the messenger. It's the scribe. It's the translator. It's not the actual source of the information itself. That would be the sun. So that's something I forgot to mention with the sun itself. But anyway, I was talking about how Mercury retrogrades most often. So one part of, I mentioned at the beginning, speed is a part of each planet's meaning. Generally speaking, the closer a planet is to the sun, the faster it tends to travel, and therefore, its cycles are much shorter, and therefore, the planet has more to do with our short-term reality. It's much more visceral on a day-to-day level, rather than maybe on a long-term level. So it's easy, if you are looking at things on a day-to-day level, it's easy to say that the sun, moon, and the inner planets are the most dominant forces in our lives. But if you're looking at things on a more long-term perspective, then you would say that the outer planets are more dominant. They affect things more in that kind of way. Another thing too is that the slower a planet moves, the more intense it becomes. And I'm not sure how else to explain that. If you've observed this, you know what I'm talking about. So that's why it's very interesting with Mercury. We see both sides of this. Mercury can travel very fast, but then so much of the time it will slow down, appear to stop, and then slowly retrograde. So in a weird way, when Mercury is, or any planet for that matter, but Mercury in particular, because it retrogrades so often, it spends a lot of time stationary. Actually, let me rephrase that. It doesn't spend a lot of time stationary, but it does frequently become stationary, if that makes sense. For short amounts of time, like maybe just for a few days. So when Mercury is stationary like that, it becomes much more focused, much more intense, and it almost acts a little bit more like an outer planet would. It almost acts a little bit like Pluto in a weird way, because Pluto is another small, heavy, dense kind of planet, which always travels slowly. So when you do see Mercury kind of stationary in a weird way, it almost is a little bit reminiscent of Pluto or maybe another outer planet. So my point is there's a lot of variability with Mercury. Mercury's very fast. It's very slow. It's also very hot and very cold. The daytime, the sunlit side of Mercury can it's said to reach upwards of 800 degrees Fahrenheit or 430 Celsius, and at night it can get to a chilly negative 290 degrees Fahrenheit or negative 180 degrees Celsius. So that's another component. I mentioned how, the hotter planets tend to be, they're literally warmer, they're more nurturing, they are more positive in astrology, and the colder planets tend to be more difficult. So Mercury's kind of all over the board. It can be a very hot planet. It's also a very cold planet. That's another thing that we see with Gemini and Virgo energies. They can be very warm, very friendly. They can also be very cold, detached. And that's something that you'll see with me as well. I can be very warm and animated and even very personable at times, but I can also be very awkward, very detached, and cold as well. I'm all over the place. Anyone with Mercury very strong on their charts will be that way, if that makes sense. So that's just yet another example of how kind of variable Mercury is. And I think I pretty much covered everything. We talked about the temperature, the size, proximity to the sun, the appearance, and the speed. So yeah, with any of these planets, if you do think of other examples of why the planet is the way it is astrologically, definitely let me know in the comments, because I know that I didn't pick up on everything. I know that there's at least a few kind of connections that I may have missed. So I would love to hear any of that. I think it'd be an interesting conversation. And but yeah, that's pretty much all I've got for Mercury. Let's talk about Venus. So Venus is, it's said to be generally the third brightest body in the sky after the sun and moon. So kind of a big deal. Obviously that does depend on, it may be the third brightest planet in the sky, but if Venus is close to the sun, obviously you're not going to see it. And because of, what I mentioned, Venus does orbit closer to the sun than the Earth. Therefore, Venus will always be semi-close to the sun. But getting at least, upwards of 60 degrees away from the sun, it gets enough distance to be its own, distinct entity, unlike Mercury. In natal charts, and I guess transit charts as well, in many ways, Mercury usually will act as kind of almost like a component of the sun, because they are usually in the same sign. So that's a little bit different with Venus. Although Venus does spend a lot of time near the sun, Venus also gets enough distance away. So I guess you can, the way we applied that with Mercury, if we apply the same rationality with Venus, we'd basically say that, Venus has to do with energies that can be shy, that can be, comfortable being kind of overshadowed by other more dominant energies. But at the same time, Venus can be a little bit, attention seeking as well, right? It can be, the brightest star in the sky. And I think this is so, if you know Libra or Taurus energies, since Venus rules over Libra and Taurus, you'll know that these signs fit this so perfectly. Like Libra is a great example of, Libra does tend to maybe not really act in a way to get too much attention necessarily. Libra can be a very shy and introverted sign. But Libras like attention, though. They do. Like, they're shy about getting it, but when they do get that attention, they enjoy it. That's the best way I could kind of phrase that. Taurus as well can be a little bit more reserved, but they also like that attention as well. So it's a little bit more kind of nuanced. You get kind of the best of both worlds with those Venusian energies. And I do have an image for Venus. We're not just going to look at this image the whole time. Let's see, what can we talk about with Venus? So Venus is a benefic. I forgot to mention that with Mercury, Mercury can be so hot and so cold. Mercury is neutral. It's said to be semi-androgynous. It's not an overwhelmingly masculine or feminine planet. That goes back. Okay, let's talk about Mercury for a second. I guess we're not done yet. Sorry about that. This is going to be disorganized, but that's just how I do things. So with Mercury, because it can be very hot, it can be very cold, it tends to be overall it's kind of a neutral energy. If Mercury has to do with information can be helpful, it can be confusing, information can be, fun, or it can be um, anything but fun. It can be distressing. It's all over the place. By its very nature, it's kind of a neutral and all encompassing. So Mercury's a neutral energy. In pantheons around the world, Mercury was usually personified as a male character. But in astrology, I do think it's more of a androgynous kind of energy. You can see that with Gemini. I do want to cover a numerology series as well, but you can see with Aries, Taurus, Gemini, 1, 2, 3. Aries is masculine, Taurus is feminine, Gemini is kind of androgynous. Gemini is kind of like the child in a way. So Aries plus Taurus, male plus female, 1 plus 2 equals 3, male plus female equals child. So Gemini almost represents creativity, creation in itself, which is kind of it almost tries to be like a third, like a triplicity. Even though we live in a dualistic universe, Mercury almost wants to be kind of detached from all of that and be that like third party in a way, if that makes sense. So yeah, Mercury is doesn't really have so much of a gender. I would go as far as to say, Mercury is more detached, kind of like what we would expect from a yang or masculine planet. But Mercury is also very nuanced. It's focused on cycles, kind of like a feminine planet. So that's where, it can kind of do both. That it's another example of how Mercury is multifaceted. It can be masculine, it can be feminine. It's kind of both. And I forgot to mention the moon is, of course, feminine. It's also a neutral energy as well. This is gonna be a hot mess. I'm so sorry, but the moon. I forgot to mention moon is not really malefic or benefic either. It just depends on with Mercury. It depends on your relationship to information. Is that good or bad? Moon, it's your relationship to emotion. Emotion can be really good. It can also be not nearly as pleasant, right? It's all over the place, just like how Mercury is all over the place with information. Moon represents every shade, every range of emotion. Therefore, it's very positive as well as very negative as well. It's just, you can see that with a full moon. It's just a crazy day when you have a full moon. Lots of good things happening, lots of bad things happening. It's all over the board. So Moon is neutral, Mercury's neutral. Sun is the only benefic we've talked about yet. But that does change with Venus. Venus is another benefic, right? So I would actually go as far as to say that Venus is probably the most auspicious planet that we work with in astrology. And that's part of, let's actually go back to this image again. So this doesn't compare to actually seeing it for yourself. If you haven't seen Venus in the sky, I would really encourage you to go out and see it. Most nights you can. It's pretty easy usually. Jupiter as well, which we'll talk about later. But Venus, like I mentioned, it's the third brightest, thing in the sky usually. So the Venus appears very bright and shiny. It's easy to see why Venus has a positive connotation in astrology when you actually look at it for yourself, because it looks pretty. It literally does. Jupiter does as well, for that matter. But yeah, it literally looks pretty. So that's part of why Venus is so positive. This makes me want to look at Mercury because I really haven't. I don't even know what it looks like. But anyway, so Venus is a benefic. Venus is probably the easiest planet that you can work with in astrology. It makes life easier, more fun, more pleasant. It has everything to do with desire and attraction. Part of that is Venus is the hottest planet in the solar system. So that goes along with what I was saying. The hotter the planet is, the more positive it is. So it's kind of interesting. You would think, like Venus is completely inhospitable. It's totally toxic to life. It's covered in clouds made of sulfur, and ammonia, I believe. So it's a really kind of toxic energy, but that's actually not what we're talking about here. For whatever reason, the hotter the planet is, the more positive it is in astrology. It doesn't matter if it's hostile to life. I guess it doesn't matter, perceiving it from Earth. It doesn't matter, we're not living there, so that's not what we're talking about. Perceiving it from Earth, it appears pretty. These are two different images of Venus. I didn't really research kind of the difference of how these images are like generated or what have you. I do think it's interesting how Venus almost looks like the sun, especially in the right image. But yeah, in a weird way, I guess there are some connections to the sun. Venus is, when it comes to like the physical composition of Venus, Venus is very similar to Earth. It has like a solid surface. It has a thick atmosphere, very thick atmosphere. It has much more in common with Earth, but at least when it comes to this appearance, this image, it looks similar to the sun. And astrologically, there are a few similarities to the sun. Um, the major difference is sun is a very masculine energy. Venus is very feminine, right? Um, and honestly, I'm not exactly sure why. I guess it's a more kind of subtle energy, kind of like the moon. You could kind of say that about all the different planets, though. Um, Really, the only masculine energy, well, other than I guess Mars and Jupiter are the only masculine kind of planets we'll talk about after this. So I guess Venus is distinct that it is a benefic, and it's also not super large like Jupiter is. It's not really dominating anything necessarily. It's definitely one of, if not the brightest kind of star in the sky, so to speak. I know it's not technically a star, but you get what I'm saying. It looks like a star. So I don't know. Yeah, I can only speculate on why Venus is a benefic, other than the temperature connection. That makes a lot of sense. But why is it feminine though? I don't know. It kind of just is. Uh, but anyway, so yeah, it appears bright and shiny. It's pretty. It's hot. We talked about that. There is a dual-sided nature with Venus as well, not nearly to the extent of Mercury, but it is important to note that like Venus rules over Libra. Libra in itself is very dual-sided, kind of reminiscent of Mercury or Gemini. So Venus, although Venus is overwhelmingly positive in astrology, there is a dark side to it. So it's not always as black and white as there's good planets and bad planets. There is more nuance there. I can always find a silver lining, even with the darkest, the worst transit, the worst planet. There's some benefit there, and likewise, even with the most positive, auspicious planet, there is a dark side there as well. I would say Venus is generally the most pleasant planet in astrology, but like we mentioned, it's ridiculously hot. It's a toxic planet, and there's a connection to Lucifer or Satan, which is kind of wild. And honestly, I don't think I covered the whole. I don't think I uncovered the whole story there. But basically, what I found when I was preparing for this video, Lucifer was called the morning star. Depending on which side of the sun Venus is on, Venus is either called the morning star or the evening star, because you always see it in the morning or the evening. Kind of similar to Mercury, because Venus is always close to the sun. You're either going to see it most prominent just after the sun sets or just before the sun rises. So I don't know which time this image was taken. I don't know if it's, if I kind of imagine that Venus and Mercury are following the sun and the sun has just set, but I guess maybe the opposite is true. Maybe they're all rising. But either way, that's why Venus was said to be the morning star or the evening star, and for whatever reason, Venus has this connection to Satan and Lucifer, I guess. Um, you know, there's this whole like weird theory out there. Let me know what your thoughts are on this. But basically, there's this whole like kind of, I don't know, weird theory that Venus didn't used to be there until like 6,000 years ago or something, and it was literally like a fallen star. Like it came out of nowhere and had a really wild orbit for a few thousand years before it eventually settled into this very like circular orbit that it has now. I'm not saying I believe in any of that necessarily. I really don't know what to think of all that. That seems kind of out there, even by my standards. Um, but I don't know. So there's this saying that Venus is like a fallen star. Kind of like Lucifer was like a fallen angel. Lucifer also literally translates to light bearer, and as we discussed, Venus is a very light, kind of bright, shiny planet. I could also see the only connection I could really think of when it comes to the themes is that Venus has to do with like very tempting energies. It's very seductive, like Taurus and Libra are very seductive, and I really just chalk that up to the appearance of Venus. It looks so bright and shiny. It looks like a little diamond in the sky, right? Oh, now that song's gonna be in my head. Hate that song. But anyway, so the only connection I could think of is Lucifer or Satan, is seductive, right? Like it said, he's said to seduce the minds of men and women and whatnot. That's the only kind of connection I could sort of think of, but let me know what your thoughts are on that. I really did try to dig into that, but I couldn't find quite as much information as I maybe wanted. But another couple connections. So Venus is kind of a temptress, right? Aphrodite, aka Venus, was said to, beguile the minds of men because she had such a beautiful, kind of sing song. She was seductive, charming. And something interesting, a connection to Lucifer, is that Venus only retrogrades in like about five, not necessarily five signs, but five areas of the zodiac. And I don't have an image for this. I didn't think of this. I'm sorry. I can look an image up later. But if you actually chart the retrograde cycle of Venus, it makes a pentagram. It makes a star, much like you would kind of doodle a star, a five-pointed star. It makes that. And as you probably know, an upside down, like a pentagram, five-pointed star is associated with Lucifer slash Satan. So that's another really kind of bizarre connection. But maybe that just kind of shows you that, Venus has to do with pleasure and desire. Obviously those are generally good things. It represents what we want. But at the same time, is it always good to get what we want? There can be a kind of dark side there. There can be that gluttony or maybe that kind of sin there. I don't know. Let me know what you think. But yeah, I think that's pretty much what I have for Venus. Let's talk about Mars a little bit here. So Mars is the third inner planet, and Mars is a different story. So as you can see here, Mars is kind of ugly. This is a particularly ugly picture. I had trouble with some of these images, I'm not gonna lie, but in finding them. Not all of them are downloadable, and as you probably know, I'm not technologically savvy. But I'm supposed to be. I don't know. I didn't get that part of the Mercury experience, I guess. But anyway, so with Mars, you can literally see this. If you perceive Mars in the sky, I have an image for that as well, by the way. But Mars is kind of ugly. Mars looks angry. It really does. Like Venus is all bright and shiny, and Mars has this like reddish, orangish, like brownish, kind of rusty color. This is the best image I could find, and like I said, this image doesn't none of these images compare. If you can actually observe Mars or any of these planets in the sky, Mars looks pissed. It really does. If you see it in the sky, it looks angry. It looks like jealous, angry. So it's no surprise that Mars is a malefic in astrology. It's said to make life harder. It has to do with aggression and ambition, and it's the male side of getting what we want. Venus is the more feminine side. Venus is less energetic. It more has to do with getting what we want in a more sophisticated way. So using our intelligence or our beauty or our charm, something like that, using our skills or aesthetics in order to gain what we want. So Mars is much more direct. It's much more straightforward. It's going to get what it wants through brute force. One more thing with Venus, though, as well. I didn't mention how, of all the traditionally visible planets, I actually have the most trouble with Venus when it comes to looking at opposing yet complementary themes. Venus rules Libra and Taurus. The only thing I could think of is that Venus has to do with beauty, and to have ultimate beauty, you need that like superficial kind of aesthetics, which is something more explored by Libra, but you also need that substance there as well, which is more explored by Taurus. So that's kind of the only thing I could think of opposing yet complementary themes that are explored by Taurus and Libra. Taurus is the sign, probably more than any other sign, that has to do with substance and kind of material, what's underneath the surface in a way. And then Libra is more just about superficiality. It's kind of the opposite of that. So, but yeah, Venus ends up being all about aesthetics. Maybe that's why, though, because Venus appears so beautiful from a distance, but when you get close, it's toxic. It's kind of like, I was going to say it's like Libra. Not that Libra is toxic, but, it's just more about appearance rather than substance. I don't know. But Venus rules Taurus too. So I guess it's a little bit complicated. Venus is more of a nuanced, kind of sophisticated energy. That's the best way I could put it. Mars is more crude, it's more straightforward. I forgot we were actually on this image. I really like this image because, not for one, I think it looks cool, but for two, I think it looks like it's labeling Mars on what is clearly an image of the moon. Although if you look closely, you can see Mars as well. But I kind of want to make this the thumbnail. I don't know what you think of that. Anyway, so Mars is a malefic aspect with ambition, drive, sexuality. Mars and Venus act as two counterparts, a little bit reminiscent of the Sun and Moon, although Venus and Mars are not quite as big players as the Sun and Moon. But Venus is the feminine counterpart. Another key difference is that with the Sun and Moon, Moon was kind of a neutral energy, Sun was positive. With Venus and Mars, Venus is the much more positive energy, and Mars is the troublemaker. Mars is, I guess, more negative astrologically. One theme that I've noticed as well with yin and yang, or feminine and masculine energies, the feminine energies tend to be more oriented towards stability, kind of, and the masculine energies tend to be more disruptive, right? And I see that connection, that pattern elsewhere as well. So it's kind of a bit of it actually gets a little bit complicated. The feminine energy is more open to like cycles and more kind of open-minded with ideas and things like that. But it's not as open to total experimentation or total like chaos. It needs some kind of stability. Whereas the masculine energy is very straightforward. It's more linear, but it's also more open to dramatic change, I guess you could say. So that's something we see with Venus and Mars. Venus is more oriented towards stability. It's a lower energy planet. So that's what I was talking about with, if you have Venus strong in your chart, you're going to get what you want in a way that conserves your physical energy. So using your intelligence, using your charm, etc. Mars is just going to use brute force. It doesn't have time, it's not going to necessarily think everything through. Mars rules Aries and Scorpio, so if Mars has to do with kind of battling and getting what we want and fighting, it's as simple as Aries represents offensive fighting, the external outgoing kind of side of getting what we want, whereas Scorpio represents the more strategic, defense, or I don't know, strategizing. So Aries is like, let's just go out there and get it, let's fight for it, let's do it now, whereas Scorpio is more about planning. It's more about, I guess, slightly more feminine. It's more conserving energy. But anyway, so yeah, much of Mars's meaning comes from its appearance. It appears red, dusty, rusty, angry. So its energies tend to be that way. Also, with its temperature difference, it can oscillate somewhat dramatically. I have noticed, though, very interestingly, I'm going to say I personally believe that, if you've listened to me for 50 minutes, then you must vibe with what I'm saying on some level. So I'm going to open up a little bit and tell you, I believe that there is life on Mars. I'm not talking about bacteria. I'm talking about people, animals, like huge insects. I believe that. And so I find it very interesting that, years ago, when I was first learning about the planets as a child, it was estimated that Mars would fluctuate dramatically in temperature, hundreds of degrees. Well, I mean, it's still estimated. It basically, like, the temperature fluctuations have narrowed, from our estimates. It's currently estimated that during the day, of course, depending on what latitude you're at, things like that, Mars is said to reach maybe the 70s Fahrenheit. And at night, it can go down to negative 225 Fahrenheit or negative 150 Celsius, and the highs are in the 20s Celsius. So that is a huge, by Earth standards, yes, that is a huge fluctuation. But by kind of solar system standards, that's actually not a huge fluctuation. There are certain kinds of like trees that could actually handle that level of fluctuation temperature wise. Obviously, I know there are other components necessary for life, like an atmosphere and things like that, but we're not talking about that right now. We're just talking about temperature. Temperature wise, it is a semi-stable temperature. But my point is, it's not an overwhelmingly hot or cold planet. It can kind of be both. It is a little bit more on the cold side, so then it kind of makes sense that Mars is a malefic planet, since I mentioned the hotter planets are the benefics. So this is a colder planet, but more and more over the years, my perception of Mars is that, I know that traditionally Mars is viewed as a malefic, and I understand why. Like Mars can often have to do with, like, if you have a strong Mars transit, there's a much higher chance of you having a violent accident, hurting yourself, cutting yourself. It could be like getting a fight with someone, maybe heated words exchanged, like feelings getting hurt, or again, like physical injury, car accidents, things like that. So I understand how Mars is a malefic. It does make life harder. But on the other hand, if you lack Mars energy, you won't be motivated. Mars gives us confidence, it gives us clarity. So I don't think Mars is all bad. I think it's the most positive of the malefics. And you can see with the temperature, it does get somewhat warm going into the 70s. So yeah, that's pretty much all I got. Let's talk about the next kind of tier of planets. We're moving into the middle solar system, and we're going to talk about Jupiter and Saturn. So this is a really beautiful image of Jupiter. You can see all its many kind of storms and weather patterns, and so Jupiter is different. Jupiter is another bright and shiny planet in the sky. It's often the brightest kind of quote unquote star in the sky. So it appears honestly very similar to Venus, at least from Earth. Even though they are dramatically different planets, the perception is similar. So it's no surprise, Jupiter is a much more positive energy. I would say it's the second most positive kind of benefic in astrology. It has to do with expansion, which makes a lot of sense since Jupiter is the largest planet. Jupiter is also very warm. I don't have a temperature on hand with me right now, but Jupiter does give out more heat than it takes in. And part of that is because Jupiter almost formed into a dwarf star. There are kind of interdimensional beings that have said many times to us that if we wanted to, if we were able to, we could turn Jupiter into a star, and that could potentially make some of Jupiter's moons more habitable. So that just goes to say that basically Jupiter is, it represents a life force. It represents a warmth. So it's similar to Venus and the Sun on that level, maybe even more so than Venus in that regard. But again, because of Jupiter's size, Jupiter is a very, what's the opposite of dense? Like, I forgot what that word is. But, Jupiter is very, it's not dense at all. It's very gaseous, right? So therefore, it's the largest planet, and, being so bright, it's no wonder that it tends to be very optimistic energy. It is masculine, if you were curious. And, in many ways, it almost acts a little bit like the sun. It's not nearly powerful enough to rival the sun, of course. We can see that. But it's the closest thing we've got in the solar system to, a dwarf star, right? It's the closest thing that would ever even be close to rivaling the sun in a way. So yeah, Jupiter acts a little bit like a star. It brings that warmth, that vitality, and we can see that with Sagittarius and Pisces. They are optimistic signs. They view everything kind of in a larger than life sort of way, right? They're kind of grandiose. Let's talk about Saturn, and I do think it is interesting to compare Jupiter and Saturn together. They are almost very opposite in nature. Because Jupiter and Saturn are sort of in the middle tier of the solar system, what you'll notice is that the planets closest to the sun have more to do with small picture ideas and themes, as I mentioned. They're more concrete, they're more kind of earthly in nature, more physical, more literal. The outer planets have more to do with abstract concepts. The outer planets are also a kind of bigger picture, so we have this kind of perfect middle ground where, Mercury, Venus, Mars are much more earthly in nature. If you have Mercury, Venus, and Mars very strong in a chart, like let's say for someone natally, that person is going to be very relatable. You know, they might be very attractive because of Venus and Mars, and very kind of easily digestible, very straightforward. So the opposite is true for outer planets, which we will get to soon. If you have, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto very strong in someone's chart, someone may appear. They may kind of seem otherworldly, very kind of strange or mysterious, complex, etc. So we have this kind of perfect middle ground with Jupiter and Saturn, where if we want to really build something that's going to last a long time, you need the energies of Jupiter and Saturn, but they are sort of opposite in nature. Jupiter appears so shiny in the sky. Saturn appears a lot more like Mars. I don't have an image for that, but they really do appear similar. Like Saturn appears kind of brown in the sky. It doesn't look pretty. You'd think because of its rings it would be pretty, but it's really not. It's another planet, like I said, very similar to Mars, at least in its appearance from Earth, that it appears ugly, dusty, kind of angry, for whatever reason. And with Saturn, Saturn does, you can get a lot done with Jupiter and Saturn together, because Jupiter gives you that motivation, the dream, right? The inspiration. But if you actually want to make something sustainable, you have to kind of pass the tests of Saturn, so to speak. And Saturn is malefic. Saturn is a very challenging energy. I think the energies of Saturn are more difficult than any other planet that we've covered thus far. And the reason why is because Saturn has everything to do with limitations, right? And there's actually a lot of reason for this. For one, at least in terms of the planets that were very familiar to ancient peoples, Saturn was the most distant planet that they were aware of, So in a way, it kind of formed, the outer barrier of what was, part of our solar system. Like, so in a way, Saturn was the last frontier. Saturn was the container. It was the boundary between our solar system and what was outside of it. Also, another clear boundary or kind of container is the rings. Saturn is unique in our solar system for having such prominent rings. So it almost has a kind of container of itself, right? And another kind of container that Saturn deals with, let me bring up this image for you. I don't know if you guys know about this or not, but Saturn has a hexagon, which is pretty unusual. It's rare to see hexagons in nature. I thought this image was pretty cool, but it's kind of like a polar storm. I believe it's at both poles. I know for sure the North Pole of Saturn has this. But it's a hexagon. It's a six-sided kind of storm, and I don't know exactly why it is this way. I just know that it is. So you may be saying, okay, how is that a container? But some people say, like, well, the six sides almost make it look kind of like a cube, I guess. So you have like the box. I'm gonna try to draw it for you. It looks kind of like a cube. I guess you could say that about any hexagon. But I don't know. People say that's just like yet another kind of example of how Saturn has another container. Saturn has a hexagon, which I do feel like the hexagon is a very kind of boxy shape. Like obviously it has six sides, but I don't know. It's a very like symmetrical, like kind of closed off shape. It really does remind me of a square or a box in a way, So I don't think that's actually too far fetched. So yeah, containers. It's got the cube on the top, or the hexagon. It's got the rings around it. It itself forms kind of a ring around our solar system. And I do think it's important to note, Saturn is not the last planet as we know now. Things do exist beyond Saturn. So it's not that you can't get past the constraints of Saturn. It's not impossible. It's just kind of a challenge, right? So that's an interesting metaphor for, it's not impossible to experience Saturn transits, to benefit from them, to I don't know, like conquer them and, rise beyond them. But Saturn does push you to manage your resources well. Let me check my notes, make sure I covered everything. Another thing too, Saturn is frozen. That's a distinction between Saturn and Jupiter. They are like fundamentally very similar, but the difference is, Saturn is a little bit smaller and much farther away from the sun compared to Jupiter. and that's why Saturn's frozen. It maybe has some star-like qualities, but it's in a much different state. It doesn't nearly have the warmth that Jupiter does. Okay, so they're almost like kind of like it's almost like good cop, bad cop. Really, they're like two counterparts that are very different from each other. Okay, let's venture into the sort of outer solar system now, and the next planet would be Uranus. And I'm showing this image. I know it looks kind of weird, and I will explain this briefly, but like I said earlier, some of these images were harder to find. I was trying to find an image of Uranus being sideways because that's something that we will talk about. And this was kind of the only one it was the first one that I found that was downloadable. So it looks in this image as if the rings are disappearing. They kind of are. It's not that the rings themselves aren't there anymore. It's just that from the angle that these images were taken at, over the years, the images were no longer visible, basically. Okay, so it's not that the rings are literally disappearing or that they disappeared in 2007. It's just that was when they weren't visible for that camera. Anyway, what's Uranus about? So Uranus has to do with breakthroughs. I didn't mention Saturn. Real quick, let's go back to Jupiter and Saturn. So Jupiter's masculine. I said that. Saturn, there's a lot of contention over whether, like, what gender Saturn is, because astrologers find the weirdest things to argue about. And but the ancients viewed Saturn as neutral. I think there's like the two feminine ones, Venus and the Moon. I think there's three masculine, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and then two neutral, which would be Mercury and Saturn. So that's why, Saturn, I definitely would describe Saturn as a yin energy, but yin and feminine are not necessarily exactly the same. Yin just has to do with, being in a rest phase, being selective. Saturn is such a heavy energy. I would say it's very clearly yin. It's not necessarily conducive to a lot of activity or spontaneity at all. Saturn is antithetical to spontaneity. It's all about strategy and being very careful. So in that regard, it's very much yin, but that's not the same as being feminine. Someone with a lot of Saturn in their chart will be very, what's the word? They'll be a leader. They'll be authoritative. That's the word I was trying to think of. Saturn rules Capricorn and Aquarius. So these are very stoic signs. They can be very cold signs. They're two of the least emotional signs, least kind of sensitive. They do have those emotions and those sensitivities, but they hold them, they contain them, right? Saturn's all about containers and containing things. So I guess the point I was trying to make, Saturn is kind of like grandfather or grandmother energy. I don't know. Yeah, it's not overwhelmingly feminine or masculine. I think because it really has nothing to do with like sexuality, creativity, anything like that. So therefore, it's not really about gender, if that makes sense. If Mercury has to do kind of with like the child and children, and there's a youthful quality to Mercury, Saturn is more has to do with like old people, right? The end of the container, the last phase of life. And both, are very early phases of life, and the very late phases of life don't have a lot to do with gender or sexuality. You know what I mean? So therefore, I think that's part of why they're more androgynous in nature. Capricorn and Aquarius aren't here. They're not usually here for a fun time in the moment. They're here, for much more mature, like long term, like they want to conquer, things. They want to strategize. They want to build an empire. They're not just like having fun and flirting and whatnot. You know what I mean? And then same with, going back to the grandfather or grandmother energy. Saturn is perfectly capable of doing both or either. So I think it's pointless to argue, is it masculine or is it feminine? Well, it's kind of both and neither. It just doesn't fall into that. And that's backed up by ancient astrologers. So I don't know why that's even a debate. I think it's silly. But yeah, if you didn't know about that, now you do. Okay, so things get a little bit different as we go into these outer planets because, for one, like I mentioned earlier, these are much more kind of otherworldly, strange, abstract, much like we would expect. The farther a planet is from the sun, the more kind of alien it seems to be, because at this point, the planets are also getting very far from Earth as well. So that's something to take note of. These plants are very slow, and also just the fact that these planets weren't discovered until much more recently. So Uranus was discovered in 1781. It's very interesting that Uranus is, it's been a few hundred years, so we've gotten to know Uranus a little bit. We know a little bit about what it represents. Uranus is associated with revolution, so it's very interesting that it was discovered in 1781 because there were revolutions all over the world around the time of 1781. The American Revolution was still taking place, the Revolutionary War in America. The French Revolutionary War was also taking place at that time, and I believe there were others as well, but those are two major ones. So very interesting that Uranus, which rules revolution, was discovered at a time of revolutions. Um, Uranus also has to do with like new innovations, new technologies, and it was discovered with a new innovation, with a technology. Something that's very key, though, that I always like to point out is that Uranus has more to do with like the air element. You would think that, because it has to do with newness and new beginnings, and Uranus is said to be the energy of earthquakes. It can really shake things up and begin things in a dramatic way. So you would think like, oh well, wouldn't Uranus be a fire energy? But it's not, and that's actually for good reason. Oftentimes, I would say more often than not, Uranus, the changes that are associated with Uranus don't actually come from, they don't originally come from a physical event. They come from your perception changing. So for instance, with the discovery of Uranus, it's not that Uranus wasn't there before, it's just that we became aware that it was there. So the only change really happening was in our perception, it was in our minds, and that's something key with Uranus. And to even further back this up, it turns out Uranus actually is visible to the Earth with the naked eye. It's just that it's so slow and so dim that it appears like a fixed star, as they called it. So in other words, Uranus just looked like another star. The ancients didn't. It wasn't noticeable, or it wasn't bright or fast enough to appear as a planet, which it is. So that's why I say, it's not only not only was it there, but it was also visible the whole time. We just weren't aware of it. So that is exactly the types of things that Uranus rules over. Changes in our perception, changes in our understanding of the world, or of our lives, of ourselves, etc. So that's a little bit deep, but I do think that's an important note to make. Let's see, and also, going back to Uranus is, it has to do with very kind of unusual, it's a weirdo, right? It has to do with weird things in astrology, countercultures, people that don't fit in, oddballs. And Uranus itself is the only planet that orbits kind of, it rotates sideways, is what I meant to say. So that's why, the rings appear like kind of vertical like this. So that's that's just another correlation we can make. And then lastly, when I was looking into my notes, I found its discovery not only coincided with all these revolutions, but it also coincided with the Romantic movement, I guess, which was kind of part of the Renaissance, and that was a time period which was generally exploring individuality and freedom, and those are also key components of what Uranus is said to represent. So, yeah, that's pretty much what I got. Other than that, Uranus also rules over groups and things like that, but I don't know how you can really connect that with with its physical properties. One last thing too. So Uranus itself, some of these planets that were discovered more recently, we haven't really And also considering astrology is not like a organized body, right? It's kind of just the Wild West, and whoever's idea is most popular is just what we remember, right? There's no like, scientific literature of what we can all agree on as astrologers. You know what I mean? So because of the disorganized nature of astrology, some of these outer planets are a little bit more debatable on its kind of properties and meanings and things like that. Uranus has, like I said, we've at least known about it for what, like 350 years now. Um, so, it's pretty set in stone, like what signs Uranus rules over. Like, we can all agree Uranus rules Aquarius, it's exalted in Scorpio. I would just, I would have a slightly different perspective and say Uranus also rules over Capricorn, but that's just me. You won't hear that anywhere else, I don't believe. So yeah. So when it comes to is it a malefic? Is it a benefic? Spoiler alert: none of these outer planets are hot at all. So I wouldn't really view any of them as a benefic per se. Uh, some astrologers have gone as far as to say that Uranus is their least favorite planet. It's the most challenging planet. It kind of depends on your point of view. I personally like Uranus, but at the same time, I don't think it's a benefic or a malefic. I think it's a neutral energy. Uranus will dramatically change your perception, and it will bring unpredictable change. So that in itself, I mean, I think we fear that. Many of us fear Uranus because it's destabilizing, and it brings change, which is scary, right? It also brings huge responsibility because when you have a shift in your perception or your awareness, when you learn something new, it gives you a choice. You don't actually have to do anything about that information, but now you have kind of it's like a responsibility. It's kind of a weight to have that new awareness. Obviously, I think it can be very exciting, especially someone like me. I'm all about Mercury. So when I get a strong Uranus transit, I can have a huge new awakening. I love learning and becoming more aware. That can be very exciting. And, Uranus can help you move on to a better life, maybe a more pleasant life. Maybe it will destabilize things in the moment, but maybe that will help you build a new kind of better structure later on. You know what I mean? But on the other hand, again, it is destabilizing. So I would say it's a neutral energy overall. And I would say the same is probably true for Neptune as well. Um, and and this may be my own subjective bias, but I think Neptune is the hardest planet in the solar system. Um, but technically, Neptune is also a kind of neutral energy. It's also difficult to kind of gender these outer planets. I wouldn't. It's almost like they kind of go beyond gender. Like they are such long term and strange energies that they don't really seem so human. Like Mercury, Venus, and Mars are very easy to kind of think about and kind of personify. Their energies are much more relatable in that kind of way. So it's easy to say like Mercury is kind of neutral, Venus is feminine, Mars is masculine. These outer planets are it's I don't know, they become a different beast kind of. So Uranus, I would say, is kind of androgynous. I think they all are sort of androgynous, honestly. So anyway, so Neptune, I wouldn't say is really masculine or feminine. It's not like the traditionally viewed planets. And I wouldn't say Neptune is overwhelmingly positive or negative either. I would, for me, personally, I would say it's negative. The reason why is because let's compare it to Saturn, for instance. So Neptune is another planet that's very different from Saturn. Um, with Saturn will challenge us, but it's very clear. Like it's like, for instance, the rings on Saturn are. Let me dig that picture up real quick. The container is very clear. It's not subtle. It's not confusing. And Saturn is pretty visible from Earth. It's not a secret. It's not like Uranus. There's no subtlety about it. It is what it is. You know what I mean? So even though that container may be constricting, Saturn's energy may be heavy. It can be real challenging. It can make your life. I don't know if I'd go as far as to say it's a living hell, but maybe. Um, but at least with Saturn, it's clear. You know exactly what you need to do. You know what's expected of you. So you might not like it, but at least it's clear, right? So that's what I personally like about Saturn. As hard as it is, it's fair and it's clear, right? But with Neptune, it's not nearly that simple. Neptune has everything to do with ambiguity, and if Saturn constricts and makes things more solid, Neptune does the opposite. Neptune dissolves. So Neptune is said to rule things like alcohol or acids, things that dissolve and make things kind of lighter. And Neptune has long been associated with Pisces, which makes sense too, because it's a very kind of nebulous sort of energy, I guess you could say. Um, and Neptune was discovered in 1846. I think it's very interesting because out of the three outer planets, one was discovered in the 1700s, one was discovered in the 1800s, one was discovered in the 1900s. So kind of interesting how that happened, how that all played out. And honestly, Neptune is a little bit strange because there are some astrologers that have suggested that Neptune may have been named incorrectly because we don't really know how the more inner planets were named, because their names go back thousands of years, maybe tens of thousands of years. So when it comes to Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, these planets that were just named in the last few hundred years, they were kind of just named randomly. Uranus kind of makes sense. Uranus is the god of earthquakes. Uranus does very much seem to be associated with earthquakes, so that does kind of make sense. We don't have a whole lot of other meaning from Uranus, the god, or the Titan, I believe, right? I don't know, but there's not a whole lot of other meaning there. There's not a lot of stories with him. There is a story about him eating his children, which maybe that connects to Uranus somehow, but I'm not really sure how it does. There's even less kind of meaning behind Neptune's name. The only thing that people really say is that Neptune, Poseidon, is the god of the seas, and Neptune was always said to be a blue, very very vibrant blue, right? Kind of like the sea. But other than that, like I said, Neptune is kind of associated with toxins and acids, alcohols, anything that either dissolves or anything that will like get you high and make you have like a fantastical experience or a spiritual experience. That would be associated with Neptune. I still think it's a bit of a stretch to connect that with the ocean, though. I guess you could say liquids in general. But what's interesting though is that when it comes to this blue color, I thought this picture was very beautiful, and with Neptune there's this kind of dual-sided nature. Neptune can make you crazy, or Neptune can make you enlightened, and it can be very difficult to know which one is true, because who is to judge? Maybe everything just gets so tricky here. It's very difficult to make sense of. Because by its very nature it can't be analyzed. There's this blurring of what is subjective versus what is objective. Like for instance, Neptune has long been pictured as this vibrant blue planet, like you can kind of see here, but recently it's been discovered that Neptune actually doesn't have that color. It's just how it was photographed, I guess. And I'll show you. Now they're saying that Uranus and Neptune actually look pretty much the same, and this is a really great image. You can see these early Voyager 2 images where, Uranus has this kind of greenish color that we've always sort of pictured it as, right? Because of the images. Neptune is this blue. It does look like the ocean or what have you. But then recently we discovered, okay, no, that's actually not what these planets look like. They look pretty much the same. They're very similar in their kind of composition. And so they both actually have this pale greenish color. It almost looks like the images got worse, really. But no, apparently that's actually how they look. So I find that very interesting. Neptune is literally about deception. And so we find out, oh, we thought it looked one way, and it actually looks a completely different way. With the Neptune kind of meaning in astrology, Neptune either has to do with appearances that are constantly changing, or not just appearances, but, the substance that is constantly changing, Or again, like I mentioned, maybe it has been the same the whole time, but we just pictured it a completely different way than it actually was. But this kind of gets you into the tricky territory where maybe like to view something a certain way doesn't make it wrong necessarily. Like there is objectivity in the subjective and there is subjectivity in the objective, and that's what Neptune kind of explores. And that's where I was saying where certain astrologers have suggested, and I'll give you some names in a second, but some astrologers have suggested Neptune was named wrong, and a better name for Neptune would be Dionysus, because Dionysus more explores exactly the themes that Neptune explores. It explores, like for instance, if you found true enlightenment, because that's something that Neptune is about, everyone would think you're crazy, right? So it's this weird boundary of what is crazy, like what is reality. Maybe one person's reality is true for them. Maybe that there is truth in that. You know what I mean? And so things just become very I understand all that on a mental level, but at the same time, like it's almost like if you found true enlightenment, it would actually make it more difficult to survive and thrive on this earth. And then in a way, it's almost not valid because of that, right? Why would you make life harder? But it's like reasoning itself doesn't really apply here. You can use reasoning any type of way. Like for instance, Neptune rules Pisces. In the past couple of years, 2023, 2024, we've had Neptune and Saturn in Pisces. And so we've had like a very Neptunian kind of mini area where no one knows what is real or not. And I think that's a great way of kind of experiencing or visualizing the Neptune energy. No matter what you can think of, any kind of opinion, no matter how far out it seems, there's an article backing that up. There's studies, and that's why no one can agree on anything. We all, I think deep down, we don't know 100% for sure what is real or not when it comes to politics or, even diet, everything, no one can agree. Everyone's kind of just in their own world, right? So that's how Neptune likes it, right? Which I don't like that. Me being more Mercurian, I want everyone to agree. I want us to look stuff up and be able to agree, yes, this is true, whatever. Maybe exchange different information, learn from each other, and then agree on something. But that's just not how Neptune works at all. Neptune's fine with, we all have our own different experience. We all have our own reality, our own perception, and at the end of the day, you never know what is true or not, right? It's like, didn't Socrates say that or what have you? Like, the wisest person knows that they know nothing at all. So that's Neptune. Neptune teaches us just to kind of accept reality. So I'm sorry, I got a little... it's on topic, but at the same time, how does all that connect to the planet? I don't really know, honestly. The only things I can find are... Neptune was discovered at a weird time when, a little bit similar to now, society was kind of diverging. The 1840s were kind of the build-up before the Civil War in the United States. So that's kind of one example of, a little bit like today where everyone had different views on things, different opinions, different perspectives. I believe there's also kind of like a spiritual revival in the 1840s as well. And different kind of crazes, different fads, different lifestyles were becoming popularized. And so, we're seeing something kind of similar today as well. And yeah, I don't know. That's all I found. Neptune's a very cold planet, so I do think it's... the only reason why I don't think it's a malefic is because Neptune isn't all bad. It kind of just has us explore different states of mind. It can be pleasant. But in order for Neptune to be pleasant, you have to be very malleable and just accepting. That's why Pisces will thrive with Neptune's energy, because Pisces is down for the ride. They're down for whatever. They aren't really attached to the outcome so much as other signs that are more controlling, like Virgo, right? Yeah. So I don't know. That's all I got for Neptune. I don't know. Let's talk about Pluto. And that should wrap this video up. All right, so here I have the like classic heart picture, which I guess was taken July 2015. I thought this was a recent thing. I thought we just got this image a few years ago, but it's been almost 10 years apparently. So anyway, Pluto was the last kind of planet discovered. Obviously, now Pluto is said to not be a planet anymore. We'll talk about that. But I believe most astrologers use Pluto because it does have very visceral effects astrologically. There are other like kind of sort of planets or planetoids as well. Like I should have done my research. I didn't think of this till just now, but there's a more feminine kind of counterpart to Pluto, which I think is part of the whole reason why Pluto was taken off its planetary status. But anyway, so my personal domicile scheme, I say that Neptune rules not just Pisces but also Sagittarius, basically like Jupiter. And I would argue that Pluto rules not just Scorpio but also Aries, much like Mars. I would say as we go farther out, the planetary rulerships basically just follow the same pattern that the inner planetary rulerships did, just in reverse, right? Starting with Uranus with Capricorn and Aquarius, Neptune, Pluto, and then the planet just beyond Pluto, which I'm spacing the name of, would rule Libra and Taurus, which works perfectly because she's already kind of associated with an entity that is related to Venus or has to do with Libra. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there. But Pluto is a malefic. Pluto is distinct among the outer planets because Pluto will make life more difficult for sure. In a way, Pluto really does remind me a lot of Saturn, which kind of makes sense because in a way Pluto was the next kind of container. Like for a while, Pluto was the last planet that we were aware of that was part of our solar system. So Pluto kind of took Saturn's job in a way. You know what I mean? It was the new container, the new frontier, the new boundary. So Pluto represents yet another kind of boundary, another test, another challenge for us. And again, it's a similar thing because it's not that nothing exists beyond Pluto. Even within our solar system, there are other bodies. You can travel outside of Pluto, but to do so, you have to pass the test, right? So Pluto is a challenging energy like Saturn. The difference, though, is that Saturn is very concrete and kind of detached and emotionless in nature. It's more just about, challenges with resources and things like that. Pluto is much more instinctual. Pluto is pushing our evolution on a more emotional and instinctual level. So Pluto will bring up like insecurities, things like that. Pluto was discovered in 1930, which is very interesting because Pluto is said to have a lot to do with like media and mind control, population control, and things like that. And what was going on in 1930? Like the TV was kind of coming out, media, radios becoming popular, a lot of technologies that are used to communicate or to control, for mind control, basically. So that's very interesting. Also, Pluto, like I mentioned before, Pluto is very small and dense, kind of like Mercury in a way. So Pluto is all about focusing. It's not. It's different from these last planets we talked about. Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune. They're all gas planets. So I more picture them as like professors in a way, astrologically. They're all kind of teaching us something. They're all very like long-term and abstract, not just because they're outer planets, but also because they are very large in nature. So Pluto is distinct because it is an outer planet, but it's very small and dense. It's more about focus and refinement, And it's interesting too. The smallest and densest planets in our solar system, Pluto and Mercury, they both have themes in astrology about refinement, getting rid of what we don't need. Mercury's all about, efficiency and things like that. So Pluto is about those things as well, but again, on a more emotional and kind of instinctual level. Let's see. So Pluto was named by a child, also kind of random. I do think this meaning makes a little bit more sense. Pluto, Hades was the god of the underworld, has a very dark kind of connotation, and that kind of checks out with Pluto being, very cold and a malefic as well. Um, we talked about how it's small and dense. Pluto also spends more time retrograde than any other planet. I believe it only retrogrades maybe once a year, but then it proceeds to spend half the year retrograde, basically. So Pluto's all about being very thorough. You can't you can't just skip over something with Pluto. If you think you can be like, oh, I have these insecurities, but I don't want to deal with it. Let's just pretend it's not there. Pluto's gonna bring it up and make you deal with it. Like, Pluto's all about being extremely thorough, painstakingly thorough. It takes, I would say, like 3 years for any kind of Pluto transit, or Pluto aspect rather, to go by, kind of. You know what I mean? So yeah, and Pluto has a lot to do with countercultures, a little bit similar to Uranus, and so it makes sense that Pluto has taken its planetary status. It's an outcast. It's an outsider, right? So Pluto has that kind of vibe. It makes sense. Pluto rules Scorpio, which is a very, individualistic energy, I guess you could say. And these things are, the things that I'm listing off about Pluto. That's exactly what Scorpio is about. Scorpio is about evolving and refining. I did say Pluto should rule Aries as well. I do think Pluto is kind of more associated with Scorpio. Another thing too, I didn't mention, I didn't even think of till now, but Pluto's orbit is very elliptical, which is different from any other planet that we've talked about in this video. Chiron also has an elliptical orbit. I'm not going to talk much about Chiron in this video. So Pluto's not the only one, but basically what that means, Pluto. See, this is such a terrible video. I'm so sorry. I would have prepared an image for you here, but basically, Pluto's orbit is not circular. It kind of gets slingshot around the sun, and so it spends part of its orbit. It goes much farther out than the other part. So because of that, Pluto spends much more time in Taurus. It spends more time in Taurus than any other sign, as well as the signs kind of surrounding Taurus. So right now, as I'm making this, Pluto is actually in Capricorn. It will soon be in Aquarius again for a final time. So as it proceeds to go through Aquarius, and 20 years from now, going into Pisces, Pluto is slowing down, is the point that I'm making. Pluto reached its perihelion, I believe is the word, the fastest kind of, shortest part of its orbit, back in the 80s when Pluto was in Scorpio, the 80s, early 90s. So that's part of why, we can see changes in society kind of going along with Pluto. Pluto's elliptical orbit is one of many reasons why we saw so much change so quickly during the, kind of 70s, 80s, 90s, the time surrounding that fastest part of Pluto's orbit. Everything was just changing so fast. So that's part of the reason why, because Pluto was spending, 10 years or less in each sign, whereas, now things will gradually slow down as Pluto is spending, 15 years in Capricorn, I believe, 20 years in Aquarius, and I want to say it spends 30 something years in Taurus. So yeah, but I don't have as much meaning behind Pluto. You could argue Pluto is more of a male energy, well, or female. I mean, it rules Scorpio, Scorpio is ruled by Mars, which is masculine, but Scorpio is also a water sign. So it's feminine. So Pluto maybe is androgynous as well. I'm not sure. Hades is, of course, masculine, but I don't know. That's all I got. So I'm not the best when it comes to videos like this, but I thought I had some information. I do feel there's information here that may help you, or I don't know, maybe expand your knowledge a little bit. So yeah, hopefully, I hope that helped. I hope that was insightful or entertaining in some kind of way. Definitely comment below if you would like. You can also email me anything, manic.mercurian@gmail.com. And hit me up for a reading if you want that as well. I put my website in the description, and you can purchase readings there. Okay, but thank you so much for watching. Have a great day. I'll talk to you later.